Hi, this is Pat Johnson, and welcome to Psych 150. In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about the two issues of nature versus nurture, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, and then also the biopsychosocial approach to understanding human behavior. All right, so nature versus nurture. First of all, let's talk about what we mean by nature versus nurture. This is the great debate on why people act the way they do. And some people say people act the way they do because of their nature, and which means biology, and then other people say, nope, it's nurture, it's the environment. So let me give you an example. When I first started teaching many years ago, I was teaching a night class, and the first night of the night class I had a student come, and he got to the class early, and he was all ready. He had a notebook, he had a pen, and again, he was there about a half hour before any of the other students had gotten to class. I greeted him. I went about my business of setting up the class, and about 5 minutes before class started, he jumped up, he came up to me, and he said, I need to talk to you before class. And I said, okay, what's up? And he said, there's only one reason I'm here taking this class. I thought, okay. And he said, I have this teenage son, and my teenage son is really messed up, and I want to know, was he born that way, or did I raise him in a bad way so that he became messed up? And what this student was really getting at is he was wondering, was his son messed up because of his nature? In other words, was he born that way? Was there something in his biology that caused him to be that way? And then on the other side, the father was asking, was his son acting in a strange way because of some type of environmental factor? In other words, this would be, are we raised that way, or do our external surroundings cause us to be that way, our peer group, the media, things like that. So again, this is the nature versus nurture debate, and I'm sure all of you have heard about it. So I want you to think about, what did I answer this student? Did I tell him it was nature, or did I tell him it was nurture? Was it biology, or was it the environmental factors? So what would your answer be to that question? Well, I didn't say it was nature. I didn't say it was nurture. I said it was probably a little bit of both, because that's the way most behaviors work. There are both biological and environmental factors involved. All right. In psychology, we don't use nature versus nurture anymore. We have a newer way of understanding why people act the way they do, and we call this the biopsychosocial approach. And as you can tell by my saying it that way, there are three parts to the biopsychosocial approach: biology, psychology, and the social aspect. Now, biology, or the bio part, would be like the nature versus nurture. It would be all those biological aspects to understanding our behavior. So that would be what we would mean by bio. When we're talking about psycho, we're talking about thoughts and feelings. How our thoughts and feelings affect our behavior. Again, psycho means thoughts and feelings, and social refers to the environmental factors. So you can see how, put a hyphen, mental factors, environmental. You can see how this actually expands on nature versus nurture in that it includes our biology, psycho, which is thoughts or feelings, and then social, which is the environment. So let's take, for example, let's give an example of depression. Imagine somebody's depressed. How could we use the biopsychosocial approach to helping understand their depression? Well, first of all, are there any biological aspects to depression? Well, yes, of course there are. It could be a neurotransmitter imbalance. It could be a brain injury. There are all sorts of biological aspects to depression. Are there any psychological aspects to depression? In other words, are there any thoughts and feelings we have that could contribute to being depressed? And yes, obviously, think about if somebody had some negative thoughts about themselves, like, I'm a horrible person and I'm stupid and I'm never going to do anything right. That would be psychological thoughts and feelings component to depression. Could there be any social factors to understanding depression? Well, yes, obviously. Think about things that could be going on in the person's environment. They could have lost a job. They could have failed a class. They could have had a relationship breakup. All of those would be environmental factors that could explain depression. So instead of using nature versus nurture, now psychologists pretty much use the biopsychosocial approach to understanding human behavior. Now, if you want to watch or learn about a really cool case study on the biopsychosocial approach, you could take a look at a guy by the name of David Reimer. And David Reimer, there's a lot of YouTubes on David Reimer. You could Google David Reimer and find some written content. But David Reimer really hits home, his story really hits home on the importance of looking at all factors, bio, psycho, and social. David and his identical twin brother were raised in Canada in the early 1960s, and a horrible accident occurred during David's circumcision where David's whole penis was burned off. They were using not a scalpel, but they were using, at that time in Canada, they were using electricity to burn off the foreskin of the penis. And so David was an infant. He had no penis. He only had testicles. And a guy by the name of Dr. Mani out of Johns Hopkins University suggested that his parents just raise him as a girl, have his testicles removed, and just raise David as a little girl. In other words, they were ignoring all the biological aspects of gender and ignoring all the psychological aspects of gender and just saying if you change the environment, you can have a successful, we'll be able to successfully make him into a little girl. Well, again, if you go to YouTube or you look up David Reimer on Google or another search engine, you can find out that this failed horribly, and David was very, very miserable as a girl because, again, his DNA was of a male, his thoughts and feelings were a male, and it didn't matter how much they made it a female environment. He wasn't having any part of it. And there's a really sad ending to this story, too. So anyway, in this short little video, we've talked about nature versus nurture, and nature being biology, and nurture being the environment. And that's kind of an old way of discussing why we are the way we are. And now psychologists use the biopsychosocial approach to understanding human behavior. Again, where bio refers to biology, psycho refers to thoughts and feelings, and social refers to the environment. So just to end this little mini lecture, I want you to think about yourself and your behavior and who you are. And part of who you are is your biology, and part of who you are is your thoughts and feelings, and part of who you are is impacted by the environment. So hopefully this helps you prepare for understanding the information in Chapter 1.